So first of all, the advantage of being a startup, which you might have, I'm a startup close. Tim has actually been promoted to the head of engineering.
Thank you.
I mean, might as well correct it. Oh, there we go. It works. So we have a lot of content here, and fortunately, Sans gave us all of 30 minutes to go through a lot of content. So be ready for it to go fast. And one of the casualties to the presentation was that we had this idea about tying in the multiverse of Spider-Man and all of that stuff. And you're not going to get that. You're just going to get content.
In a different universe, they get all those references.
Yeah. So here is Tim's bio, but we actually have something we want to add to it. Patrick?
Uh-oh.
No, you come on up.
You know what this is?
I don't.
It's a beer ice.
All right.
All right, you are now number 285.
Wow.
You want to go to the bio? I don't have a mic, so you're gonna have to talk. I just did that part.
Okay, for those of you who aren't aware of the Beer ISAC, this is an informal community really co-founded by Patrick Miller and Chris Sistrunk from Mandiant, where it is the see something instead of just saying something. We also drink something, can be non-alcoholic. So an informal group community driving around industrial control systems. And Tim is now the newest member.
Wow. Thank you. Completely unexpected.
I didn't tell you in advance because I wanted it to be a surprise. So I do ridiculous things. We got that much. Let's get going. All right. So for those, this is going to be a quick summary to level set. If you would like more wow, the echo in here is something else. There was a talk that I did at Sans ICS last year with a senior manager from Oklahoma Gas and Electric, Ian Anderson. How low can you go? And so we shared a lot of details there. And so I'm going to provide the summary to level set you, and then we're going to go into even further detail on how to look at unifying IT and OT risk assessments in your infrastructure. So the first part is the Purdue model. Everybody in here knows the Purdue model, right? We're all, yes, I can't see you, so I'll pretend you're raising your hands. I can come into the audience. We can make this interactive. You know, like nervous laughter. For those of you who see me speak, you know I will do it. So the Purdue model gets misused, right? It wasn't originally meant to be kind of the enterprise architecture for security that we use it for. And so the intent of level setting this up front is I think a lot of folks, when we look at this and try to put the defensive perspective on it, it feels like a pretty good defense in depth. We've got 5 levels. That's 5 levels of defense, right? Well, it's not. When we look at it from the attacker perspective, that actually collapses down to 3, and really 2 are the most common ones we need to think about. The first is the big squishy target of enterprise information technology. Your IT environment is the most common access point to be eventually laterally moving to becoming a threat vector to you. Then we have this concept called the beachhead. So the higher level systems that are managing the lower level operational technology devices in your environment, those are the beachhead, right? Your HMI, your SIS, your DCS, potentially historians. And what kinds of operating systems do they run? That was a question to the audience. You can shout it out. Windows, Linux, right? Kinds of things we see in enterprise. So the point here is that that's the most common vector in, and then I don't need to go lower, because what is the purpose of an HMI? It's to tell everything below it what to do. So from an attack perspective, once I've got there, I have access to accomplish what I want to do, and the rest of those devices at the 0, 1, and 2 layers basically collapse. So security is defined by the threat. I think this is part of what makes this discipline of cybersecurity so much more difficult than what we see everywhere else. When I want to engineer a bridge, I pretty much know the components to being able to engineer a bridge to take a certain amount of weight. And yet, what is that weight when we look at security? We do all of this work. We have the existential dread that approaches as a 3-day weekend comes. That clock starts moving to 5 o'clock. Will I get the 3-day weekend, or will there be an incident? And it's not really a question of, are we good? How much have we invested? How much have we trained? How many tabletops have we done? It's the fact that there is this threat, this actor out there that has a vote. And so at the end of the day, the assurance of our systems comes down to that vote. Security is defined by the threat. All of the regulatory and compliance pieces are the foundation. Our ability to replicate and understand the threat and all of those potentials is the definition of security. And so your stack is the threat's test bed. Your tools, your configurations, your processes, that's what they test before they ever deploy. If I'm going even a little bit off of the topic here, this is something that I believe is my hypothesis when I look from a threat intelligence perspective of what have folks been doing in critical infrastructure, right? There's a lot of this discussion, what's the red line? I believe the red line is known. And most of the activity that we see in critical infrastructure is them basically validating their tradecraft as they continue to learn and develop more reconnaissance and insight on the tools, the configurations, the people, and the response of our critical infrastructure. So, testing maturity. New device not found, USB 1 power overload. So, testing maturity. What we're trying to do here is put the perspective of testing is a maturity itself, right? Hey, Bryson, thanks for saying I need to be able to understand the threat. What are my abilities to do that? Well, recognizing that there's a continuum of what we can do. Almost everybody is familiar with vulnerability scanning, right? Don't you love turning Nessus on in an OT environment? Okay, you got the joke. That's good. I was checking with you. So vulnerability scanning, right? Looking for known bad thing. That's very much like a checklist approach though, right? Because I can only look for what I already know to be bad. Tying that up to a vulnerability assessment, and then penetration testing, where we're now bringing the human creativity of the actor to work with tools to understanding what are the potential weaknesses in a system. And the first thing I will note here is the most common flaw to this approach is it tends to be a system view. Well, the definition of a network is not a system in isolation, it is a system of systems. And a vulnerability in one place can have an impact or an access to another where there is no vulnerability. So first part, because most of you are already doing this, just recognizing the limitation is it is a system view and you're missing the systems of systems perspective. So here's where we're going to throw things a little bit differently. We've been working on this idea for a long time. One of the things that originally brought me up to being more well-known in the community was where I took the offensive security side of this industry to task. All too often, we had these folks who would, and I'm sure a lot of you have experienced this, right? You've had a red team before. Again, just pretend you're raising your hands, I can't tell. Where they show up, you establish the scope, the nerds grumble about the scope, the threat doesn't respect your scope. Well, sorry, our production environment does, so that's going to be the scope for the red team. They disappear for 1 to 4 weeks, and they show up, hopefully not with just a Nessus report, because it's a red team, right? We're supposed to see real production. And they show up with a report of, here are all your problems. Oh, do you already have a 40-hour-a-week job? Good luck fixing them, see you later. That was the industry. And so we pushed this concept of, why don't we fix it together? And so Rob in the introduction briefly touched on purple teaming, which most folks, because we all went to kindergarten, know that red plus blue is purple. Good job, you all got gold stars. But purple is more than that. So the definition I would like to offer is, it's a collaborative, milestone-driven exercise. We are going to agree together what the scope is and what we're going to do. And one of the first advantages we get out of that is that we're able to tie business objectives to what we're testing. And the reason that we have purple teaming up front once we're crossing over into deeper offensive security testing is because it's something easier to get started. And there are a lot of free tools that you can use to get started. And then from there, we want to graduate. So instead of just, we found problems, here's a report, purple teaming, we fix it as we go, and that's the outcome of the exercise. Once your organization earns a level of maturity doing that, then you can start to move on to adversary emulation, more realistic threat emulation. The beginning with purple teaming, you're probably going to do simplistic technical controls validation. By the time you get to adversary emulation, we're going to try to chain those together to build really complex attacks because that's what allows us to see deeper into our own defensive infrastructure. And then finally, then let's get to red teaming. Let's have the confidence on where we're at, and then let's set a exercise in motion that is going to act like a real adversary with their own imagination. Let's let them to try to just win, because that's where we can really start to test the limits of our imagination and our understanding of ourselves, but let's earn our way there as opposed to the way we've been doing it. So I decided to finally trademark my own model, okay? So for those of you who don't know, I'm an Army officer, so the blank look is not fake. I really am this dumb. And so everything has to be simple. So you've heard kill chain. MITRE attack is great, but it's a lot of detail. When we want to understand the threat at scale, there's only 3 phases we need to understand. Reconnaissance, we're casing the neighborhood. Initial access, we're picking the lock. And this is the part that we as an industry are held up on. So I've picked the lock, the door opens. So what? Right, short of there being a denial of service, initial access is exactly what it just sounds like. I've just gotten call back, I'm there. I haven't done anything yet. And so the next phase, effects. This is what you care about. This is where you have control. Those are your assets talking your way. And that is where the actor has to put down additional code or use your code to accomplish their goals. So this is where we can see them in motion and do something about it. So I decided to combine that into something I thought was pithy. So welcome to BAM. All right, what is the best defense? And this one I am going into the audience. You're the closest. What is the best defense of any defense?
Help me. You said offense?
Well, offense is a good one. So I like that because that is kind of the topic of what we're going through. What do you think the best defense is?
Being off.
Being off. Okay, it's true. If it doesn't work for you, it doesn't work for the adversary. He's not wrong. One more, because he's in the ballpark. Nope. Carter.
Yes. The best defense is not being there when they go to attack you.
Not being there. So like an air gap?
That, if you want to call it that, but they don't.
They don't. You're giving away my slides. Right? The air gap. You can't hack what you can't touch. But as Carter has already ruined my joke, an air gap is not an air gap, is not an air gap. It's a theoretical thing. Try me, right? If you actually look in your environment, the assumption of an air gap is very much that. It is assumption. Prove it. So the best defense, to what you just said, offense, right? Understand the threat, be the threat. So understanding the threat. Well, the first part for our threat factor is reconnaissance. So I'm looking at external IT systems because IT is still the most common access approach that eventually gets to OT. And then actions on objectives. Where are those bridge systems, right? We talked about in the collapsed Purdue architecture that I have those beachheads. They are there, they talk. That is what the threat is looking to cross over if they're trying to have OT impact. So the reality is you can, in fact, protect OT by strengthening your IT insight. The two are correlated. So some actions on objective. The first, when we talked about, right, testing itself is a maturity in its process. And so what is my ability to test a particular tool? So in this case, we have a creation of a file as a binary blob that's encrypted. That is my maturity of being able to conduct a test. I know these are kind of hard to read. The slides are available afterward. Recording the course will be available afterward. The jokes won't be as funny the second time. The second is signaturable, right? This is where we're looking at our ability to understand kind of what I call yesterday's threat intelligence. Indicators of compromise, which are typically files, domains, and IPs, right? A file signature is something, particularly when I am close to when a threat is sweeping. So when we see this in the environment, I want to be able to stop simple things. When we get later, we're going to want to build something more complicated because, of course, the threat has already evolved from that threat intelligence and what they're doing. But this is a very easy way where, in this case, we're looking for the exact executable name that that threat was using. I think that one is from Indestroyer, if I remember correctly. And then finally, emulation. So Tim's going to talk a little bit more about how to do some simulation later, but just kind of tying it real quickly. Simulation is where I am pretending to do the thing. Emulation is where I am doing the thing in context. And so again, tying to the maturity of our testing, those are going to be different levels that we grow to, as well as, particularly in an OT environment, critical where I don't want to cause impact, but I might want to simulate causing impact because that's what ransomware is. So be the threat. So I created this idea about 2 years ago, and that there are 3 variables to any testing that you're going to do. The first is obvious, scope. Scope doesn't have to be large. I don't have to do everything. I can start very simplistically. Working with a single host in a lab environment gives me some insights. Now I'm leaving some things on the table by doing that, but it's a starting point because there are a lot of other elements to building trust to growing this in my culture. Then the complexity, right? We talked about the testing spectrum of maturity. Well, you don't have to start complex. I can't remember if it stayed in the presentation, the free tooling.
No.
It got cut, okay. So if you want to get started, Red Canary makes a great tool called Atomic Red Team. It's free, it's open source, and it is really easy to use to establish simple technique execution, and it's all built for you. Start in a lab, start simple, it's free. Great place to start. That's at the bottom of the complex, right? And then as you build confidence, you build trust with IT and OT, we can grow from that. And then the final piece, frequency. I don't have to run exercises every day. I can't possibly keep up with my normal operational demand and making those fixes. So the frequency that you're driving these things, these are the 3 variables that you can control that determine what you do in testing.
Now it's me.
Now it's you.
All right. So a message that we've always heard is people like the idea behind testing, but then when it comes to actually executing or going through with it, that's when people start worrying. What are the impacts that I'm going to have? Because these are things that we've all seen. So that requires a lot more deliberate testing from security testers, from security professionals. Going to have to work together with the people, the experts that are experts, maybe not in cybersecurity, but in how the system works. I think both keynotes and a lot of speakers have already hit on that this is less of a technical challenge than more of something that is a people and culture challenge. So it requires having a more deliberate mindset. And of course, that leads to sort of the overall thing we've been talking about, which is trust and building trust between teams. And I'm going to go through a couple of ways where you can do that, despite also needing to test these different systems. So this is something that as security testers, you never want to be on the side of things where you have this bad of an impact. And luckily, this one was not, of course, from any security testers. But this is what security testers have to think about when they are trying to say, I need to test this, or I need to do these things. These are the headlines that we've all seen in this room that everybody has in the back of their mind when they're thinking, we're going to go mess or test these different devices or tools.
So jumping in on that, you're going to hear me say there is a silver lining to Colonial Pipeline. What is it, you ask? So Colonial Pipeline, because being a hydrocarbon-based economy, turned ransomware into a kitchen word. After Colonial Pipeline, your grandmother knows what ransomware is. It's true though. I mean, Chris Krebs and I got up at RSA for a keynote in 2020 and said ransomware is coming, and everyone was kind of like, some people in the audience sort of got it. Some people were like, kind of, what is that? I mean, the scourge of ransomware hadn't yet hit us, but the ability to impact citizens' lives in this part of the energy infrastructure, which underpins our whole economy, made it a kitchen word. Now, what's the silver lining? When you go to the OT side, when you go to the executives to get the buy-in for testing, they understand now the potential impact. I mean, it's the same thing as the Target breach in 2012. That changed the entire ecosystem of understanding forever in business. Well, Colonial Pipeline did that for all of us in ransomware in this industry.
Yeah, great points. It's a tough lesson, but I mean, we got to pull something out of it. So being deliberate, talking about from a security testing standpoint, for those of you that have used Metasploit or heard of Metasploit for a long time, there was initially in a release of it called AutoCon. which would throw essentially the kitchen sink of security tests at whatever you were trying to exploit. And of course, one of the challenges with that is it crashed systems. There were a lot of issues with it. And so this is the idea behind this is you can't do that, right? These systems are critical. You need to understand what you're doing. It's not going to be something that you can go search ICS or OT red teaming on GitHub and just download and execute it on your OT systems, because that's not something that is going to build that trust. It is not going to be something that is reliable enough unless you understand all of the code that you are executing. And that's, again, part of why we are trying to do this, is to safely demonstrate impact, not just throwing something out, as Bryson mentioned, and having sort of this report at the end. One of the ways we've seen this to sort of show you that IT OT crossover here is with ransomware. Everyone's heard it. As Bryson mentioned, it is something that everyone has at least seen. Now, this is something that whenever doing purple team exercises, people are always very concerned about, well, we're going to do a ransomware test. What does that mean? That, this is going to lock up all of our computers? What is that piece of it? And realistically, you don't need to do that. Ransomware at its core is going to encrypt some files. Realistically, most of them, it doesn't matter what files they are, whether they're files that we've generated or they are files that are real business files. The problem is, if you start encrypting real business files, can you decrypt them? Are you confident in your ability to do that? And so those are the things that the idea behind when we're testing some of these very destructive types of malware is to make sure that we are doing it in a way that still proves to the point so we can check the defenses around it without needing that business impact so that we aren't encrypting real data. And so the same thing when we are talking about, as Bryson mentioned, when you hit something like an HMI or one of those beachhead systems, you don't need to convince, or most of the times, people don't need to be convinced of the impact that can happen if you are able to send additional commands or things to it. Proving that you have network connectivity from that HMI to one of the devices or several of the devices, I mean, at that point, it's a tabletop. You can get people in the room to say, what would happen if we change these values? But we know we have network connectivity. I don't need to change the temperature or anything like that to prove the point. And so that's where it's really important as we're continuing to build the trust across the industry and how we're safely testing these things, that these are the types of approaches we're taking, and this is what we're thinking of as we go through this. Now, stages of testing, I've heard at least a couple of speakers today talked about sort of the passive versus active. We've seen a lot of folks, which this is the way I think it's been done for at least the past couple of years, have really honed in on that passive side of data collection, whether on the network or out of band sensors. And so that's where they will collect it, whether it's in the lab or in production. No one's too concerned about the impact that's going to have. But then it comes to the active testing, bringing in external tools, things like that is where maybe people are starting to test those in a lab, but they're not really ready, whether it's the tool isn't ready or the team isn't ready to test that in production. But this is something where I want to insert one other stage that already exists in all these networks that people often forget about, is the vendor tools that already communicate with these devices literally every single day. You don't need to develop your own custom security test tool. You have these programs and applications that already either communicate with the devices over their native protocol on a regular basis, and regular here being, they might be doing a 1 or 5 second heartbeat check. So you have that connectivity that's constantly being proven. You've probably paid a lot of money to have those applications so you can either program or manage some of those devices. And the question becomes then, well, what are all the things that those applications and programs can do? You know they can communicate with the different devices. You know it can do that. So in this case, it's already in your production environment, so you don't have to do necessarily additional testing or vetting it to see if it's going to crash or break one of the tools. And so this is something that I just like to continue to highlight, is that that's something that's already there. You don't need additional tools in order to do that. However, the cool thing here is that there's also precedent from the IT side of it, and it's called living off the land. You might have heard of this from it's called LOLBIN or LOLBAS, and this is a security-focused project that talks about, and in this case, it's Windows. You have Microsoft signed files and binaries. We've seen ransomware pick up these types of things where they will use these types of scripts that Microsoft uses for good, right? They happen in the background when you're using your computer all the time, and they've managed to take the intent behind those programs and use them in order to execute their malicious payloads. And so this is the formal definition that we've seen that I pulled off of GitHub. And so I think what we can do here, though, is change this to have an ICS OT edition. And so I've swapped out a couple of things. I've crossed a few things off. And this, what it comes down to is, do you know what those vendor applications in your environment that talk to your devices every day, do you know what they do? Do you know all of the features? Do you know the functionality of it? And that's something that I think continuing to explore that from the test perspective is going to be something that allows us to test over and over again without having to introduce a lot of new tools and new techniques that need to talk to our devices. And so this is something that I mentioned before, and keep hitting on, it's already production safe. It already happens. And so this is a way that we've seen adversaries in this space take advantage of tooling. They, as Bryson mentioned before, they start in the IT network, get to the point where they have network connectivity, whether it's identifying an application or they do their own asset discovery and scanning, and then they use vendor tools against the devices themselves. And the more difficult part of this is you have to determine the intent behind those actions, which means you are having to measure something that is not just technical. You are looking at, is this something that is good for me or bad for me?
So real quick thinking exercise. How often do we think of encryption in an operational technology environment? You probably laugh, right? Like, not enough, right? Because I mean, we have this challenge of, we have this capital investment of these devices that are 20 to 30 years old. And how do I partially implement encryption? And for any of you who've ever implemented encryption, even on the IT side, it's a pain, right? Has anybody ever rolled out MFA before? Yeah, I can hear a yes, so I get, it's my agreement over here. And the challenge, right? Things break, right? We just operationally broke things. So my point on this is we don't expect encryption in the environment, but it is there. Think of your HMI, which again is running Windows and Linux. Well, those operating systems have organic encryption capabilities, which is now can be used for an unwanted purpose of the attacker not having to bring down their own encryption code. They can use that to be able to do ransomware. So just again, a potentially unwanted application inside of something that is naturally a part of a vendor device.
Exactly. And there is a process for mitigating and working on this. The detection engineering process is something that this one has been more IT focused, and this is something that we've continued to see more and more use across IT space, but I think it actually works really nicely as well for ICS and OT related protocols, because the idea behind it is determining the intent behind the action is much more difficult. You need to add context that only you as either a system owner or operator are going to have. You know what your normal looks like, whether it's a certain time of the day or a season that's turning things on and off. All of the different data that you're seeing, and this goes to what are you collecting, that's something that is going to drive what you're able to see, and of course, what your defensive tools are going to be able to alert on. And so that's where detection engineering is this entire process. There's additional presentations you can give on just this, but the idea behind it is that this is a measurable process for us to go through and improve what we're doing and make sure that any of those tests that do reveal gaps, we can fine tune it and find what is the thing in my environment that I'm able to tag this with so that I know that this is going to be something that helps me determine whether it's malicious intent, whether an attacker is pushing this new update, or whether this is something that one of our engineers is doing. Anything to add on this, Bryson? Let's figure that out. So it all comes down to building trust. And so this is, the circle of trust that we've traditionally had for either system owners, operators. It's been, anything you do, that's great, but it can't touch any of the systems. And of course, part of that is because we haven't built that trust, and we're going through the process of doing that. And so using these things, these applications that are already in the environment, instead of asking for continually more scope, is working what's with there and working with the experts in that area to move our security testers into that circle of trust so we can do this on a more recurring basis. Now, this is the last thing, just kind of summarizing everything about trusting, like building trust through testing. Bryson covered a bunch of this already on the productions deciding the scope, and then validating things in a lab. Like if you don't have a lab environment, I mean, you can see all of the different vendors that have walls out there, the ICS village that have these labs that you can build and test and showcase things on. So that's something that there's a lot of precedent for at least working with it. I know there's a lot of other system owners we've talked to that are also building their own lab environments to replicate what they've got. But the idea behind all of this is you want transparency in your testing. And then, as Bryson alluded to, as far as frequency, you get to decide, unless you are under certain regulations and you have to do it quarterly. But the idea behind it is this doesn't have to be done every day. You have your other jobs, right? Your 40 hours already. And so continually asking for more is something that is a big ask at first. And we're seeing a lot of organizations that are taking this either, doing something quarterly or something through like once or twice a year.
So the summary of the presentation and these variables are, we have this challenge of culture and trust. IT and OT speak a different vocabulary even. They have different priorities. IT doesn't even worry about availability most of the time, whereas that is the fundamental part, plus this additional thing called safety. You ever talk to an IT engineer about safety? I plug the right things in the right countries. That's the best I got. Whereas, so conducting testing means we have to bridge these things. And this is why we believe that purple teaming as a process is a fantastic way to do it. Because as with everything, communication involves transparency. It involves me being able to understand what we're doing. Validating in a lab, conducting smaller scopes help build those blocks that grow to a stronger foundation where, you know what, you might only be able to do your purple team exercises on your own in IT to start. And then eventually OT will get to watch. And then they'll build trust in seeing you go through a process that you've done, seen the buy-in, seen the results. Trust that your tooling, your exercise works. And then tiptoe across into simpler systems. Build the bridge. Don't try to start with the San Francisco Bay Bridge. For those of you in RSA last week, I just flew directly from there last night at 1 a.m. Start with small things. And so this is where the purple team process of saying, here's the scope, here are the TTPs that we're going to do it, here's how we're going to do it. And then as we do it together.